The Blood Eagle, Scandinavia's most terrifying execution. The Hook, the year is 867 AD. Northumbria, in the north of England, lies broken beneath a Viking army that has waited 11 years to arrive at this exact moment. In the Great Hall at York, a king is dragged before his captors. His name is Ælla, and he is about to become the centerpiece of one of the most disputed, most horrifying execution methods ever recorded in human history. The men standing over him are the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, and they have not come for gold. They have come for something older than gold. They have come for vengeance. And vengeance, in the Viking world, was not meant to be quick. Ælla is stripped and forced face down onto the cold stone floor. What happens next, according to the Sagas, defies ordinary cruelty. A blade is drawn along his spine. His ribs are severed from the backbone, one by one, and pulled outward through the skin of his back until they resemble a pair of bloody, spread wings. His lungs, still functioning, are drawn out and laid across his shoulders, rising and falling with each excruciating breath he somehow continues to take. The men around him do not look away. They call this the Blood Eagle. And whether it happened exactly as described, one truth is impossible to deny. The story alone was enough to terrify an entire continent for centuries. The context. To understand why a punishment this extreme could exist even as legend, you have to understand the world that produced it. 9th century Scandinavia was not a single nation, but a scattered network of warrior societies bound by kinship, honor, and blood debt. Vengeance was not a crime in this world. It was a sacred obligation. If a father was murdered, his sons were expected to answer that murder in kind. And the manner of the answer mattered as much as the act itself. A quick death settled nothing. A death that broadcast suffering, that turned punishment into performance, sent a message no witness would ever forget. Ragnar Lothbrok himself occupies a strange space between man and myth. Ancient sagas describe him as a legendary raider and king, though modern historians remain deeply uncertain whether he existed as a single historical figure or was instead a composite of several Viking leaders, whose exploits merged into one legendary name across generations of oral storytelling. What is far better documented is what came after him. In 865 AD, a massive Viking force later called the Great Heathen Army landed on English shores, and Norse tradition holds that Ragnar's sons, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan and Ubba among them, led that invasion specifically to avenge their father's death. According to the sagas, Ragnar had been captured by King Ælla of Northumbria and thrown into a pit of venomous snakes, dying slowly and in agony while reportedly declaring that his sons would make England pay in blood. Whether every detail of that death is true or embellished by generations of skalds hungry for a good story, the invasion that followed was unmistakably real, and it reshaped the political map of an entire kingdom. For 11 years, the Great Heathen Army carved through England with terrifying efficiency. Northumbria fell first, then East Anglia, then large portions of Mercia. Kings were captured, kingdoms dismantled, and the old order of Anglo-Saxon England was thrown into chaos it would not fully recover from for a generation. Northumbria, the very kingdom ruled by the man said to have killed Ragnar, was the first domino to fall, and its collapse set the stage for the moment the sagas remember most vividly, the reckoning with Ælla himself. The core. The sources describing the Blood Eagle are not contemporary battlefield reports. They come primarily from Norse sagas, written 2 to 3 centuries after the events they describe, most notably in later Icelandic literary traditions and skaldic poetry that reference the eagle carved into a victim's back. This gap between event and record is the central problem historians wrestle with. Some scholars argue the Blood Eagle was a genuine, if rare, ritual execution reserved for the highest status enemies, a method meant to symbolically sacrifice a defeated king to Odin while transforming his corpse into an offering shaped like the god's sacred bird. Others argue the entire ritual is a literary invention, a dramatic flourish added by later Christian chroniclers and saga writers eager to paint pagan Vikings as monstrous, or by Norse poets exaggerating the brutality of legendary ancestors to elevate their reputation. The anatomical claims themselves fuel this debate. For the Blood Eagle to occur as most vividly described, a victim's lungs would need to remain functional enough to visibly expand and contract once removed from the ribcage and exposed to open air, a physiological outcome that modern medical understanding treats with significant skepticism. The human body under this kind of trauma would likely succumb to shock and blood loss within moments, long before any symbolic wings could be arranged. This has led some historians to propose that later skalds may have misread or dramatically reinterpreted an earlier, simpler poetic phrase describing eagles feasting on a slain enemy's corpse after battle, transforming a common battlefield image, carrion birds picking at the dead, into an elaborate execution ritual through generations of retelling. Regardless of which version is closer to truth, what the sagas insist happened to Ælla remains one of the most vivid passages in Norse literary tradition. He is described as bound, forced prone, and subjected to a slow, deliberate mutilation, intended not merely to kill him, but to transform his death into a message. Every cut, every moment his body was forced to continue functioning through agony, served a singular purpose: to ensure that word of what happened to the man who killed Ragnar Lothbrok would travel faster and further than any army could march. Fear, in this context, was not a side effect of violence. It was the entire strategy. A kingdom that heard how Ælla died would think twice before crossing the sons of Ragnar, and an army that carried this reputation into battle gained a psychological advantage no shield wall could provide. It's worth noting that Ælla was not the only figure the sagas associate with his fate. King Edmund of East Anglia, martyred by the same Great Heathen Army in 869 AD, is likewise sometimes connected to blood eagle imagery and certain later retellings, though his death is more consistently described in near-contemporary sources as execution by arrows, a detail that further complicates how much of the blood eagle tradition reflects real practice versus retrospective, embellishment layered onto multiple victims over time. The aftermath, whether the blood eagle was performed exactly once, several times, or never at all in the way the sagas describe, its cultural weight was undeniable. The story became inseparable from how later generations, both Norse and English, remembered the Viking Age. For Anglo-Saxon chroniclers writing in the shadow of Christian civilization, the tale confirmed everything they wanted to believe about pagan brutality, a useful narrative for framing the Norse as irredeemable savages against whom any resistance was righteous. For Norse audiences centuries later, listening to skalds recount the deeds of Ragnar's sons, the story reinforced a proud and terrifying lineage, proof that vengeance among the Norse was not a passing anger, but a debt paid in full, however long it took. The broader consequence reached far beyond one king's fate. Northumbria, already destabilized, could not reorganize fast enough to repel the army that had delivered this message. Within a matter of years, the kingdom's independent rule effectively ended, absorbed into what would become the Viking-controlled Danelaw. The psychological terror sown by stories like Ælla's death rippled outward across England, contributing to a broader climate of dread that made resistance harder to organize and surrender easier to justify. Fear, once again, proved to be as strategically valuable as any weapon carried onto the battlefield. In the centuries since, the Blood Eagle has taken on a life far beyond its disputed historical origins, appearing in modern television, literature, and popular imagination as shorthand for Viking brutality at its most extreme. This modern fascination says as much about us as it does about the 9th century. We are drawn to the idea that human beings were once capable of and willing to witness something this deliberately theatrical in its cruelty. Whether or not any version of it was ever literally carved into a living man's back, the story endures because it captures something true about how vengeance, honor, and terror intertwined in a world where reputation could matter as much as survival itself. The conclusion. Perhaps the most unsettling part of the Blood Eagle is not whether it happened exactly as described, but why humans have needed the story to survive for over 1,000 years regardless of the answer. Every era finds its own reasons to retell tales of extraordinary cruelty, sometimes as warning, sometimes as entertainment, sometimes simply because the boundary between myth and memory blurs so easily when the subject is suffering severe enough to feel unforgettable. Ælla may or may not have died with his ribs spread like wings on the floor of a Northumbrian hall, but the fact that so many generations chose to believe and repeat that he did tells us something quieter and perhaps more disturbing than the act itself. That the line separating history from horror story has always been thinner and more deliberately blurred than we would like to admit.